Hello, everybody, one and all, and welcome to edition 3 of Let's Talk About Some Bullshit. And this time we're talking about Medal of Honor Pacific Assault, the second attempt by EA to make a Pacific World War II game, the ever rare breed of World War II games that no one really ever takes a crack at. And to be honest, I was gonna skip this one. I wasn't really gonna make a video on it, but after perusing the old footage, there was one thing that made me really want to talk about this one, and that would be, honestly, the intro. The 30-minute intro to this game, because the one big thing I've always criticized about first-person shooters is that they always either skimp on their narrative threads altogether, or they're so played out, pedantic, and repetitive that they're not really worth committing anything to memory because they don't do any little goddamn thing that any one of their predecessors have already done in the process and repeated another 15 times. It gets really fucking annoying because unless you're really gonna go balls out super creative with the gameplay, then unfortunately story is gonna be the only way that your game is going to be interesting on the FPS scale. And thankfully Pacific Assault made a real humdinger of a start, and quotation marks on the start part of that sentence, as we'll talk about later. It starts out with a brilliant intro where we're introduced to our main protagonist, we're introduced to his squad in Bad Company style without any of the comedic stuff, and it's all played up in this good old boy attitude and this little bit of an inspiring undertone to everything. Like, we're talking about people's accomplishments, their goofy personalities, we get to see a little bit of the banter back and forth, and then later on when we get introduced to Basic, we get the classic Full Metal Jacket drill sergeant character played almost exactly like the iconic scene that everyone remembers when you think about a drill sergeant, except he's a little bit different voiced. It's honestly a little bit shittier, but to be honest, in mid-2000s PC gaming, this was kind of, it still works, and it's still kind of acceptable because I think that this was the bridge between the 6th and the 7th gen. Pacific Assault was a bit of a later game. I think this was probably as the transition was going to the PS3 era, so this still works. And it's a brilliant little speech that they had written for him because he goes in a bit of a different direction than you would really think. Because he starts off on a religious angle with this whole description of the army. He ties it into a religious allegory, but instead of doing that, he subverts the religious angle because he says that the Marines that he's training are better than God. So it's a little bit of this different angle and these interesting metaphors that are twisted off of their usual standard stockpile, and they're reinterpreted into this. Honestly, it's a bit of an inspiring speech, mostly because it's a unique take on this whole scene. Okay, this is something that really I haven't heard before in this manner, which made it very interesting because they tie it into the Genesis 7 Days thing that we all know about. But again, it's subverted to say something that's actually somewhat powerful and somewhat inspiring. And EA took their time to set all this up, and they really spend the time. Like, the basic tutorial section is a really fantastic tutorial because we run through basically everything like a good tutorial does. Everything that you would expect, from shooting the gun, to throwing the grenades, to running around, to proning and all that stock standard stuff. But then we get introduced to the more unique aspects, which is the command feature that other games have, where it's a squad-based FPS where you can command your subordinates to go forward, go backwards, and to heal you. And the interesting take on FPS healing, because this was the transition from regenerating to health bars, is that you can call over a medic with a limited amount of health resources through the level, and he'll heal you if he can get over there. But again, the medic can get shot because he's just a soldier like everyone else. He's not a designated medic who's sitting in the background and is protected but from all the shooting. So that's very interesting because you can't just call them over in the middle of a pitched firefight. You actually have to have somewhat of a strategy in order to get yourself out of there, because you have to determine these situations I should bring my medic over, or these situations I'm completely fucked. And again, it's a limited healing capacity throughout the entire section, so you really have to keep on your toes with that. So it's a very interesting one because it ties in this character work. We get a brilliant intro to it. We actually get given a character that has somewhat of a personality along with the other people that he knows, because they're all just weird goofballs with one defining character trait, and they're all designed specifically different from each other. So we actually get a brilliant start, and then it starts off getting a bit worse, to be honest. It doesn't completely fall apart, because obviously the first thing that we do is we gotta do Pearl Harbor, because you can't really do Pacific World War II without Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor is really the big reason why we went into World War II in the first place as America. But the problem is, honestly, this is lifted straight from Rising Sun, and that's very unfortunate because it was brilliant in Rising Sun, because Rising Sun did this first. It was boots on the ground, you're in the face of the action, you're in the thick of it, and you're doing all this stuff to try and defend yourself from the Japanese onslaught. Obviously, you can't save anything because history has already been written, so they can't just say in a realistic game that none of this happened, so you're completely fucked. But it was interesting because they had different objectives where you could save people, and you had to do like fire extinguishing things to help people who were dying under the rubble of the consistent bombings. And then you had to go on the deck to do a turret section to shoot down some planes. The interesting part where you're on a gunship and you're weaving through the destroyed and sinking battleships, and again, you're straight in the thick of it, you're getting bombed on by the Japanese Zeros as they're coming down. Like, it's an incredibly intense section and a great interpretation of the Pearl Harbor situation. So what EA did was they almost completely ripped it wholesale from that PS2 game and slapped it in this, to the point where the gunship section is almost using the exact paths and the camera angles from that other game in this game, which is completely ridiculous when you're playing through all of Medal of Honor, when it's almost completely exactly the same. They don't do as much because we don't get introduced to it in the same way. I think we actually start on the beach, so we have to go in the ship. We don't start on the ship, which is kind of weird. That we're going into a war zone to get on the ship that's being destroyed, which is just ridiculous. The thing that this section has over Rising Sun is that at least we get introduced to the city around Pearl Harbor, like the actual Pearl Harbor facility. We get to go on a little bit of a tour and kind of get to see it in its heyday before it gets completely blown to shit, which is a different take on it because, again, it has some personality, it has some banter in the dialogue that we're getting introduced to. We get to see the buildings and the actual facility from the ground up in a way that you don't usually. Again, these are the details and the care in the introductory sections that make it a lot more interesting seeming of an FPS, because usually FPSs are so boring that they get straight into the action. They don't do any of this setup, so getting the detailed walk around is definitely a good touch. It's just a shame that the rest of it is a ripoff. But then the game completely, well, not completely, but starts sliding down the quality metrics. Because then we get into the island hopping that World War II does. So we get dropped off on this jungle island, and then we have to start shooting some guys. And that's fine as a starting point, if we were going on to do something else. Unfortunately, as you start getting into the shooting, you start realizing that the World at War-esque potential of the Pacific World War II game gets completely squandered here, because not only is this more stock shooting than we really need, because island hopping was extremely dangerous because it was trapped, it was mined, it was surprise attacking and guerrilla warfare more than just stock, shoot the dudes, walk around the place and try to find them. Like, it should be stealthy, it should be sneaky, it should be cutthroat. Like, we should be getting surprised like a few times throughout each section. They dug cave systems, they laid traps, they did mines should be everywhere, that sort of stuff. But honestly, more of the time, you're just weaving around and walking around and just trying to find them through the leaves and the trees. They don't even do that thing where they're in the trees. Like, that would be an interesting ambush. We should be getting ambushed, like, all the time. Like, that's why Pacific Warfare is more interesting, is because it's supposed to be sneaky. It's not supposed to be conventional warfare, but they turned it into conventional. And unfortunately, the tactical command system doesn't really break it up to really fix this. I do appreciate that we actually have an AI squad that will shoot with us, because that's honestly almost unheard of in FPS, is that they actually bother to code that in. But it really doesn't do much to differentiate beyond a single man game, because it's not an unheard of advantage. Like, it's not a huge step up in damage that you can dish out. It doesn't seem like the AI has the proactivity to really make the most of the fact that there's 5 of them. They don't dish out the damage, they're not clearing out the places all on their own. You still have to spearhead this entire thing because their AI can't do it themselves. Like, it seems like they're half blind. They can get kills, they can't pull the work, which again is very odd when we're a squad of 5 people in comparison to a single man squad from any of the other Medal of Honor games. And then later on, when you get through the jungle, you'll get to a village, and that will be more conventional warfare. They do the sword charge thing that Rising Sun did, but they don't do it enough, and they don't mix it up and add other AI behaviors into the mix. It really is just the bayonet charge that they put in, and you don't see it all that often. Where again, the big reason why this should be interesting is constant different ambush tactics. That's the big differentiation between the European and Pacific sides, because that's how the war was started. It wasn't trench warfare like it was out on the continent. This was island hopping and having to completely take over, this small area of land that they got to first, because we deliberately joined the war late. The fact that this is so one note and so repetitive is incredibly annoying for someone who really wants more Pacific games to explore their potential. And then it just continues sliding down, because the big reason why Rising Sun was such an interesting game was we were consistently going to new places, and it did feel like an adventure, because throughout that game we went to like a desert, and then we went to an Asian village, and then we went to a German meeting, and then we had the temple level, and then we completely blitzed a train yard and that sort of stuff. But in Pacific Assault, unfortunately, you start realizing over time that the only thing they've got to play is the fucking jungle. And I get that that's realistic, that jungles are gonna look pretty similar to each other, but it's just jungle assaults. It's a freaking game of constant jungle assaults, constant fighting through leaves and trees. And the fact that they don't have a lot of behaviors attached to the enemies means that this gets insanely repetitive very quickly. And to make matters worse, the game actually has a bit higher difficulty than Rising Sun 2, so we're not just blitzing through this game. I died a pretty consistent number of times because healing just isn't everywhere, and the enemies can really take on their shots and do their goddamn jobs. And in the later missions, when we're like actually at facilities and doing defense jobs, these guys can really peg their shots and whittle you down pretty consistently. It's not super bullshit where you're dropping like 80 to 20% health in one go, but it's just consistent whittling down, and you will be getting killed pretty regularly throughout these missions. Some of these things can be real ass aches and a half, where you'll be dying probably a good 10 times before you make any real progress throughout the level, and at least they don't do like a limited checkpoint thing. If you get one, you got it, but you have to run through it, and honestly, it really does feel like you're hitting a brick wall some of these times. Like, some of these missions can really throw you on your back and not give a shit that you're flailing around. Like, you go from Guadalcanal, you go from this more deserty island, Iwo Jima sort of thing, where everything's built in, and these these buildings that are like made of sand or carved into the rock later on down the line. It really does feel like all you get is the jungle, and then you go into villages to weed around and do conventional warfare against the Japanese. which again, for the previous reasons that have been discussed, are completely ridiculous that they decide to do that. At the end of the day, this game in totality is basically Rising Sun, but more boring. Like, they don't have the innovation, they don't have the interesting levels, they don't have the goofy narrative. And that was another thing I wanted to mention, was that another reason why this game isn't as good is because after that incredible intro, like, the narrative almost completely falls off. They do some banter, but it's almost exclusively the pre and post mission wrap up or explanation, and that's about it. We do get a nice scene while we're defending the airfield, where the guy is trying to inspire us by saying we're the last line of defense, and that this is what we've all been working for, and if we don't capture this airfield and keep it tonight, we're completely fucked, and it's just gonna be game over for the whole operation. And that was, again, it was kind of an interesting speech, probably not the best topic setup, to be honest, because it sounds like it's full of despair, but sometimes you gotta talk to your guys and let them know the real situation that they're behind, because that might actually be the case. So in those cases, maybe not sugarcoating it was the way to go. And that's really why I wanted to talk about this game in general, because like, the complete letdown of that brilliant intro is something that really should be pointed out, because they had the opportunity to build some real characters and give this story an arc, an actual perspective to view these events from, and give them some pathos and give it some weight through a character arc, through the meeting of these guys. But they don't even have the good grace to have one of the characters get eaten by a crocodile, which Rising Sun did, or a guy doing a rickshaw who gets run over by a car. Again, something Rising Sun did. Pacific Assault doesn't have any of those highlight moments, those really standout things, outside of the ripped off Pearl Harbor section. That's the only thing it's got to its name, but they stole that from a previous game, almost wholesale. So ultimately, it's just really disappointing that all it is just jungle, jungle, jungle. We do get a bit where we go into a cave, but that's one bit, and they don't, again, there's no ambush tactics, there's no traps. So it's literally just like a different coat of paint for the village stuff that we've been doing throughout the game. And trying to turn an interesting warfare situation into conventional bullet gun hide and cover shit is exactly why, like, European side World War II games are boring as hell. It's because they've been doing that for 15, 20 years at this point. You could have had a brilliant narrative to shake things up, but they don't do enough with it. They don't keep with the narrative to consistently develop it into something interesting. So it just falls off, and the difficulty becomes really frustrating because you don't have anything to latch onto when you hit the end game. You don't have a connection with the war situation with any of your characters or the squad. Maybe have, one or two of them die, I don't know. You could do something with this, and they try to in a couple of moments, but it's not good enough. Ultimately, I'm just disappointed with Pacific Assault. I am just so flabbergasted that they stole a whole section from a previous game to reuse. I know that they did that with one of their interpretations of Normandy in the previous Medal of Honor games, but here it's like, this is the one Pearl Harbor section, you couldn't redo it, you had to reuse ideas from previous? I mean, come on, EA. Like, this is supposed to be your better years, before you became completely shit. And you're doing this already? It's just, I wish that this game was something. It's pretty long. Well, I mean, it has to be long considering they have the consistent dying part. They even have battling in water and swamps, which again, could have been something if they did something with it. The only real unique thing that they did do was that they did animate bodies floating down the river if you end up killing someone in it, and that's a cute detail. But it's completely wasted on a story that has no connection. It has no immersion. There's just nothing to it. I'm tired of seeing the goddamn jungle. The goddamn jungle I saw for like 60% of the whole flippin' game. Rising Sun couldn't sit still. Pacific Assault is just staying in one place and sticking it right the fuck there. I couldn't even appreciate the great Iwo Jima ending where they, come against the toughest of odds and have to rip out Japanese from underground through everything, and they have to disable, slowly but surely bomb these specific facilities and these guns in order to, breach the way, and it's a hard one-tooth dragging, knuckles bloodying conflict, and I hate it, because that's the most deaths throughout the entire game. You have a last holdout mission where you have no resources and constant enemy invasions, and you just can't deal with it. I hated that section. It took forever. And the thing that they were trying to do doesn't work in a video game, because you can do some of those things, but if you're going to constantly kill your player over and over and over again, then your whole message and what you were trying to do with the section is completely fucking lost under layers and layers and layers of frustration, despair, and hatred. And that's not the sort of emotional punch that you really want to do with a video game. Like, I don't know what to tell you. It completely fucked that message up. It could have been inspiring. It could have been, you know, the big punch, the big showdown at the end of the game. And it's just, you fucked it. But in speaking of fucking it, one thing I do want to mention before the end of the video here, which is longer than I intended. The one attempt they did at a plane section is complete trash. Like, it doesn't even work properly. It's incredibly, terribly controlled. I could see what they were trying to do, obviously, but, like, they tried to make realistic plane controls in a gamepad shooter, and it just fucking doesn't work. Like, it's ridiculous. When you get into plane shooting, the perspective you have is like less than half the screen, and you can barely control this fucking plane. Like, the movement and the guns are not independent of each other, so you have to constantly move around and adjust your movement to shoot anything, and it's just like, this thing is so touchy and barely controllable, and these planes are so tiny of hitboxes and they barely move that you're spending more time readjusting than killing things. And then there's the other thing where your perspective is so tiny, you can't even see your ultimate objective. Like, your objective is a battleship. How the fuck am I supposed to keep track of it with no good radar, no good mini-map, and the fact that my eyeballs have to be in the sky for the entire first part? Like, it's so absurd. I'm showing you clips of this, and it fucking blows my mind that nobody on the team sat the fucking leaders down and said, we can't make this work, cut it from the fucking game, because this sort of bullshit is what you cut on the cutting room floor. The first thing that should have been cut was this whole bit. Or they should have replaced it with a fucking turret section or something else more sensical, because what they tried to do, reinvent the wheel into this whole mission, is just show their asses and give us one of the most absurdly terrible video game sections in the whole franchise, because, like, it is incredibly bizarre to not only see something that doesn't work, is insanely difficult, but was apparently made by professionals who looked at this and said, okay. At the end of the mission, you have to bomb the battleship in order to completely sink it, and good fucking luck with that, because what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to drop torpedoes. You don't have a fucking mini-map, you don't have a reticle to point at you, so you just have to randomly hit the torpedo release button and hope you hit something. So maybe you should get in, like, stupid close to it, but then the battleship can defend itself, so you have to be above the air for a little bit in order to not get shot down. So you have to trial and error it over and over again. Repeat this mission multiple times because you don't have enough freaking goes during the first run to get your bearing to find your shot. And again, this plane is stupidly uncontrollable. So every run you try to do, you have to reorient yourself and fire more shots just to fucking train your goddamn gun. And it's just, like, it's so terrible that you have problems layered on top of other problems to actually get to the thing you're supposed to do. And it's not just bomb it once or bomb the particular glowing part. You have to bomb the entire thing multiple times. And on top of all that other bullshit, the torpedo could just whiff because the hitbox is fucked. So even if you dial it in, you might not actually be hitting the part of the ship you're supposed to be hitting with the fucking thing anyway. Nothing about this makes fucking sense. Like, I was stuck here for probably like more than a half hour doing this shit over and over again, because once you get to the point where you actually torpedo the thing and it doesn't fucking work and it doesn't show any sign of progress, maybe you think you're just supposed to shoot it with the machine gun, and obviously that doesn't work, so you have to go back to the dial-in Ferris wheel, whooply whooply whoop. You have to do it in fucking rounds, and it's like, wow. You really thought that this was good? You really thought that this needs a green light? You think that this should be for public consumption? Whoever the fucking director of this was fucking up his own ass. Like, I get you want to do something different to really show off, but bottom line, it needs to work. You need your video game to work before you do that. You really thought that this was good material. And with that lovely note, Pacific Assault. Rising Sun, but worse. I don't think we're actually going to come back to Pacific World War II before, EA just gave up. So join us next time for, I don't know, maybe if we're lucky we'll be looking at Medal of Honor Heroes. Garbage. Trash. Dump. Yeah, we'll figure it out later.